Well, welcome everybody to the launch of Sherry Smiley's Not Sacred, Not Squaws book. It's a great pleasure to be able to publish this book. But before we start, I'd just like to do a welcome. Welcome to country. We respectfully acknowledge the wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their custodianship of the lands and waterways. The countries on which Spinifex offices are situated are Jiru, Bunurong, Wurundjeri, Wadawurrung, Bundungurra and Noongar. We also acknowledge the many women throughout history who have fought for women's freedom and the freedom of lesbians, often at the cost of their lives. So I'm just going to begin by introducing Sherry. And actually, it's truly wonderful to be able to publish this book. I first heard Sherry talking at a conference in Canada some years ago, and I was bowled over by it. So when we received the manuscript by her, I was already enthusiastic. But of course, you do have to read the manuscript before you take it on. And I have to say, I was thrilled. So Sherry Smiley is a radical feminist artist from Nalaka, Pamuks and Diné nations. She's worked on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women with survivors in the prostitution industry. She has written for Canadian publications like Globe and Mail, Policy Options, and also Horizons. In addition, she's founded Women's Studies Online, which is also abbreviated to WMST, which is an Indigenous and women of colour led platform for decolonising radical feminist research, education, action, and movement building. And if you will all have seen the cover of the book, but the artwork on the front cover is also by Sherry. So a multi-talented woman. We have many multi-talented women amongst us, and Sherry is one of them. So thank you very much, Sherry, and I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. I'm so glad to see everybody here. I'm a little bit nervous, but that's okay. I'm not too sure exactly what it is I am supposed to say, but I do know that that's kind of how I've lived my life. I'm like, I'll just show up and I don't know how to do it, but I'll figure it out once I get there. So we'll continue that tradition today. So I am so grateful. I mean, Susan and Renate are true sheroes of mine and of so many other women that I know. So it is such an honor, just an honor that they even agreed to read the manuscript. So that alone, I was like, yes, I've made it. This is fantastic. What a wonderful affirmation, I guess, of the work that I'm doing. And then everything else has just been kind of the cherry on top. So it's been a really wonderful process of working with the women there at Spinifex. And so this book really came, so this book began its life as my doctoral thesis. So I was doing a PhD in communication studies and was really focusing on male violence against Indigenous women and girls, prostitution of Indigenous women and girls, and kind of began the book, or the at that time the doctoral the dissertation, really looking at how prostitution was a form of male violence against women and girls, and how that was contributed to or was a form of colonization. And so I began my work. There was so many things that happened during the completion of my PhD, that I there were so many times where I almost didn't finish, where I either gave up, or my mental health was so poor that I didn't feel like I could keep going. There was a lot of stuff. I was a caregiver with my younger sister for my grandparents for many, many years, and they both passed away um, during my time as a doctoral student. Um, and my grandma, I talk a lot about my grandma, so you may have heard me talk about my grandma before, but my grandma is my favorite person, one of my favorite people in the whole world. And her and I were very, very close. And she raised me up, and she was such a badass. And I start my book with a poem about her. And so I like to think that a lot of what I learned about women, about myself, a lot of that came from her. And she, I mention it in the poem, but I'll just say that um, one of the traditions that I was taught, and others, women and girls, is that, for example, when you're menstruating, um, in our tradition, you weren't supposed to walk behind elders while you're menstruating. And so I remember, hearing about this later in life, because my grandma didn't teach me that when I was young. And so when I was taught that later in life, I thought, oh, why didn't my grandma teach me that? Like, am I native enough? Like, what's going on? Why don't I know this? Um, but then, you know, insert some radical feminist theory, and I'm like, oh, okay, I know why she didn't teach me this now. And she firmly believed that women should never be restricted or confined ever, because of our sex. And she lived that, and that's what she taught her grandchildren. And so I remember talking to her about this idea that you're not supposed to walk behind elders. And she remembered one time being so frustrated that she said, well, if the elders don't want anybody walking behind them, why don't they just go sit in a corner? um, which I think in a lot of ways kind of sums up my grandma's feistiness, and her resistance. If she didn't believe in it, she wouldn't do it. And it didn't make her any less, it didn't make her any less of a woman. So she really had her own mind and encouraged us to have that too. So I lost her during the course of my thesis. My grandfather as well, who I loved very much. And that was really hard. I was far away from home. That was hard. But the hostility, I think, of academia, among other things, also made things very difficult for me. And I think in particular, there's a couple of instances when I was a doctoral student. So there was a time I was doing a presentation with this other scholar, this woman of color, who I respected very, very much, still do. I just think she's wrong on some things, but I remember, talking with her about the rates of male violence within Indigenous communities. And she responded by telling me that I shouldn't talk about that. And responded by, telling me how many white men are, raping and murdering and assaulting Indigenous women. And of course they are, but Indigenous men are too. And so it was this level misunderstanding, I think, or I think sometimes women, Indigenous women and non-Indigenous women don't really know what to do with this crisis of male violence that we experience. And there's a lot of worry about speaking publicly and reinforcing negative stereotypes, right, about Indigenous men. There's often this fear that if you speak publicly about male violence from Indigenous men, that they'll get harsher prison sentences than white men do, which very may well be the case. But that's not my fight. So, if Indigenous men want to fight to get the same prison sentences as white men, when they assault women, they can, knock yourselves out with that fight, but that's not mine. And we can't do everything, and my goal is that Indigenous men just won't be assaulting Indigenous women. Men generally won't be assaulting women in this kind of tidal wave of violence that we live in today. So so kind of coming up against these barriers, this kind of very, and I talk about this in the book, this very very, I think, obvious double standard wherein Indigenous men, when they commit acts of violence against women or girls, there's a million excuses for that violence. So they'll say, well, I was in residential school, I was abused as a boy, colonization, and that very may well be true. That very well may be part of the puzzle. But what happens then is those men and that totally unacceptable behavior gets excused and it becomes acceptable. Yet at the same time, Indigenous women who are, for example, overrepresented in prostitution globally. But if we're thinking of here in Canada, many women are in prostitution because they were abused as girls. Maybe there was a huge link between Indigenous girls who were put in residential schools, which were schools where children were taken away from their family. Many children died in those schools. So girls that left those schools and went right out onto the street in prostitution, that was a very common experience. Women are there because they're poor. Women are there because prostitution has become so normalized that it's, they think that that's their only option. And maybe it is one of a very few options that they have. Yet Indigenous women aren't, who are in prostitution or who have been in prostitution, for example, aren't seen as being victims of colonization. So Indigenous men are, when they assault women. Indigenous women are not victims of colonization when we so clearly are. And so about halfway through my dissertation, I was like, oh, crap. I'm doing this upside down. I'm doing this backwards. So I had started thinking about, okay, I need to look at how prostitution and male violence against women is a form of colonization. And I realized I needed to really interrogate our current understanding of colonization. And so it was really realizing, and at the time I was reading such amazing, that was, I think, probably the best thing that came out of my time as a student, was having the time to read and to talk with women, but to read all of these amazing texts from, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and some of these, theories of women's studies, for example, is a book that I use constantly, Radically Speaking, and these are Spinifex books, or Renate has been involved as an editor or written. So it was such an incredible privilege to be able to have the time to read these texts. That was my job, essentially, was reading and thinking. And so I realized that our understanding of colonization in Canada, we had somehow decided that was primarily a race-based process. And it was actually men and Indigenous men who had come up with the concept of colonization and the definition of colonization. And so I was like, what if we look at colonization as primarily a sex-based process? How does that change our understanding of male violence against women generally? How does that change our understanding of male violence against Indigenous women, from Indigenous men in particular? And so, so it was at that point that I realized, pretty much, most people, I think, would be unhappy, maybe reading the book. Maybe unhappy is not the best word, but might feel offended or some type of distress, perhaps, when reading the book, because you're not supposed to talk about male violence against women, and you're especially not supposed to talk about male violence as an Indigenous woman, and you're especially not supposed to talk about male violence from Indigenous men as an Indigenous woman. And so I just thought I would go in there kind of head first and really begin to rethink that concept. And so it was, what's the word? Liberating. And it was such, again, a privilege to look at the work of women from before, like, Robin Morgan, Andrea Dworkin, all of these incredible, Adrienne Rich, all of these women, because we know so much. There's so much information out there. We're not given access to it. It's hard to find. We have to seek it out. But to be able to look back at what those women had theorized, and to build on that, in terms of indigeneity, and from an Indigenous woman's perspective, was so incredible, and really helped me to sort out the contradictions that I couldn't resolve in my own head, about male violence from Indigenous men, or about colonization and what it means and how it actually impacts us. And so that's kind of what happened. And I knew that I wanted to, I'm not a fan of academic writing. I think, why? Why would you write a book that nobody can understand? I think, and so one of the things that I did do actually throughout my time as a student was I would write papers, and I would read my papers to my grandma over the phone, my poor grandma. And so if my grandma could understand, if she understood what I was writing, then I knew that I was writing clearly enough. And if she didn't understand, then had nothing to do with her. It was me. I wasn't writing clearly enough. I wasn't being straightforward enough in what I was trying to say. And so, so that's kind of the tone of the book. I have been called irreverent a few times in my life, and I take it as a compliment. So it was a lot of, back and forth and ups and downs and sideways movement, getting this finished, but here it is. And I think I will leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sherry. One of the things I love about your book is the jokes that you make, and some of them come through in the titles you have of your charts and images and so forth. And it cheered me up as I read my way through the book. So even though the subject matter is quite strong, quite difficult in some ways, there are moments in the book where you just get carried through because you come up with a sentence or you come up with a joke, and it's just perfect, and it takes you to the next step. But the other thing that I think is really critical in terms of your book in Australia, which is that I think, in spite of all the problems in Canada, Canada is somewhat ahead of Australia in this area, probably thanks to people like you. And I'm wondering what Australia, in terms of policy, can learn from Canada. Like, what have been the mistakes? So are there things that we can avoid doing, so as to not go down a path that turns out to be ridiculous? Or are there things that have been really good outcomes? What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's definitely, it's thanks to women like Faye Blaney and Sharon McIver and Teresa Nahaney and all of these incredible Indigenous women that have worked so hard for so long, to really get the issue of male violence against Indigenous women, to bring up the issue of sex-based discrimination in Indigenous communities, in government policy, and in law. So those women have worked so hard for so long, and yeah, and it's because of them that I'm able to learn from that and take that and develop the theory a bit further. I think it's that's a good question. I think that one of the most important ways, or the kind of, I think the heart of us kind of getting anywhere, is this idea of sisterhood and this concept of sisterhood. And I think that identity politics, which have gone just out of control, have really divided women from each other and really made it easier for men to separate women from each other. And so I think, so that's been very successful, whether that's in university or the government policy or among women's groups. I think that that's been at least one of the more primary ways that male violence, that we haven't been able to organize perhaps in the same in the numbers that we want to, and kind of create this mass movement. So when I was writing the book, and I was reading about some of the conflicts that had happened in Australia between white women and Indigenous women, similar but different, conflicts going on here. But I do think that in some ways, some women have been able to really bridge that gap. And there have been different groups, across Canada, of non-Indigenous women who have consistently been there to support Indigenous women from, decades back. So there are those relationships that have been built. And so I think that does give us a bit of a platform to keep moving from. And it's difficult. I mean, it's not easy. You have, there's the cross-cultural component. So there's going to be there's a different culture. But then beyond that, looking at the different ways that, or the particular ways, not different ways, particular ways that Indigenous women are oppressed, can make it very hard to, for example, show up to planning meetings or committee organizing meetings consistently can make it hard to, you know, sometimes you're gonna have an off day where maybe you have all of these memories come flooding back and you just can't get out of bed that day. So all of these, and then, you know, you're gonna have those experiences of male violence, most likely, you'll have that. And very often it'll be from an Indigenous man. And so I think it's so important. One of the most important things that I can think of, and I mentioned this in the book about methodology, is to never, ever discourage an Indigenous woman from speaking up about the male violence that has happened to her. So whoever it was and however she's describing what happened to her, to never, you know, remind her that Indigenous men are more likely to get harsher prison sentences, to not remind her that, you know, racism exists and what about him. So there's all these ways that Indigenous women get shut down. And I see that racism, I think, also divides Indigenous women from other women and women from each other. So yeah, so I think that there's we really managed to build some really awesome connections here in Canada, and I'm sure, you know, that's the case in Australia as well. And it's just a matter of really valuing those relationships and, you know, and growing them.
I have Judy ringing me, so I'm just going to go out and do this.
Perfect.
Hi, Judy.
Oh, Renate, I can't hear you. Are you? Oh, hold on, you're muted.
Unmute my audio. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to ask you a question, Sherry, because I mean, I was really also totally bowled over by your sticking it out to do your PhD and then turn in the PhD in a book. And because I have always been really interested in methodology, and you mentioned theory of women's studies, which was actually one of the first of my own writings that was then published in our book series of women's studies on methodology. And I would like you to talk a little bit about the methodology, how you write about your methodology, and also about this incredibly brave decision of yours in the middle of the PhD to actually really change tack. I mean, you mentioned that before, but you didn't really totally say why. And after you've done interviews with women on video, to decide not to use them in your PhD. And I thought that was such a really, really, really brave decision, but obviously a very good decision and a necessary decision. So can you talk a little bit more about the methodology in general, and also about that in particular about the videos?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I like talking about methodology too. And it's funny because I didn't know before I started doing this PhD, like how much I loved methodology. So it was a really wonderful thing to be able to learn about how, oh, Susan?
No. Sherry's just answering a question. Let her answer it.
How we know what we know, and how we come to know what we know, and how important that is at the beginning of the research, during the research, and after. And one of the other things that felt so important to me, and this relates to the video as well, was so this kind of idea of self-reflection. It's something that I do all the time. And it's something that's very hard to do, especially when you're going ahead and you're like, yeah, this is a great idea. It's wonderful. But you always need to be asking yourself, like, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? And that's, that can sometimes be quite, quite a kick in the butt to be like, maybe actually I'm wrong, or what if I'm wrong about this? And so doing that process throughout was really what helped me to change course. So I had started with a video, and so I have all of this incredible video footage that has not been put together. And the reason that I changed course in the middle of my PhD was for a few reasons, but one in particular was realizing with methodology. So it's not just, what questions are you asking? How are you asking them? Who are you asking them to? But it's also what happens to the research when it's completed. So realizing that the audience, whoever it is that's going to be viewing or reading this, where do they come from? Like, what are their perspectives? What are their biases? What are their standpoints, right? And so because of the hostility I was experiencing in university towards radical feminist work, I was so angry. Yeah, I was pissed right off and angry, and I couldn't find a way to show these videos, to edit these videos, to tell the story of the women and these incredible stories and interviews and knowledge and time that they had given me, and present that to a committee, an academic committee in a university, in order for me to get my PhD. I was just like, this is not okay. I'm not going to, these women should not be subjected to this really horrific process that I was going through. And I felt that what they had to say was so powerful, and so incredible, that subjecting them to this very bureaucratic academic test of worthiness was unfair to them. And so I made the decision to write instead of present a video, which is not to say that that the video will never, those videos will never, I think that they will see the light of day at some point, with permission from the women in them, of course, but not for academia, not for not as a way to help me kind of get this accreditation. So presenting that video on our terms, on feminist terms, I think became so important as I moved through that process of the PhD.
Thank you. Thanks for that. We've actually got Judy on the phone, and she has been trying to get online for half an hour, but isn't able to. So she's going to say a few words over the phone for the moment. And and actually, I should introduce Judy.
Well, first of all, I'm in Alice Springs, and I've been talking this morning to a group of elders about the youth here. But I wanted to say, while preparing for this launch, for this incredible book, which I've read 3 times now, something happened here where I am in Central Australia, which reminded me why this book is so important. It was a polite newspaper headline: police officer pleads guilty of child abuse materials. Well, when you read it, it was much, much more than that. He actually was using First Nations children here to develop those child abuse materials. So, Terry, I've just been listening as I've been sitting here, and I just say to you now that that book was groundbreaking for me. It changed me in so many ways just reading it, and it gave me hope, because I think we have to have these conversations I've just come from a group of women, Aboriginal women, who are distressed because in the conversations we have to have about the kids who are out on the streets, the kids who are hurting, and I've just come down from Tennant Creek, where the kids told us what was happening in their lives, the young people, the young men and the young women. And we didn't hear as much from the young women, but the young men named drugs on the streets in Tennant Creek, and it was like people just jumped over it. So the book itself, for me, allowed me to acknowledge what was happening inside me. There's a rage in me that we have tried to, in Australia, get people to attend to our missing and murdered Aboriginal women and children. So you said this book is born from rage. Well, let me just tell you, it opened up for me a revisiting what's been happening with our young people. I'd say it's a courageous book, but it's also a confronting book for people who don't want to face the truth. A truth-telling at the deepest level, which educates us all and calls us to consider our complicity in the truth of Canada or the truth of Australia or all colonised countries. For me, it applies to me at this moment as I work on the ground, the question where I am now. What in this country we now call Australia. So, Sherry, your book opens an essential dialogue, which I should face us all for action. I'm a little bit distressed at the moment because I couldn't get through. I've been trying for a while. I want you to know that we have the same situation in Australia, and I've been part of two government talk fests on this, missing and murdered Aboriginal women, Indigenous women and girls. And it started me when I read your book thinking of how they don't listen, how they get really distressed, the public servants, when we are giving them information about our missing and Aboriginal and murdered young women. And they say, oh, look, we've got to look after ourselves, we're upset. Oh, this is really hard to hear. Well, I'd like to question how hard it is for those of us who've been working at the coalface for quite a long time. I heard about this when I was in Canada between 2010 and 2012. I heard about the pathway up from California up to Vancouver at that time, and the number of young women that were going missing and things were happening to them. I think male violence against Indigenous women in Canada is about history. It's a history how male violence has been pushed aside, male violence on Indigenous women and women generally, but Indigenous women has been pushed aside. And I guess that for me is what happened in the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Here they talked about it, and it was interesting to me that some of our organisations just wanted to talk about the services they had, and I was giving them evidence of the information I had on specific incidences of young girls, their bodies being found, but nobody was ever arrested, and they clearly had been sexually harmed, sexually violated. I was giving them evidence of sisters of women who had disappeared, coming to me and asking to get this into the government in Australia. And what I presented was pushed aside by, look at the job we're doing, what a good job we're doing, not the needs that we have. I think also that in reading your book and the study conducted in Vancouver and in British Columbia, 52% of women in street prostitution were Indigenous. Well, in this country, and now I'm talking about male stuff, but a young man from prison wrote to me and asked for help. And I wrote back to him saying, I can't help you, but you can help yourself. And if you're willing to help yourself, you can come up to my place and we'll do some work. He had been removed at 9 months of age from his mother's arms. His other 3 siblings, the oldest was 7. She was a girl. It was 2 girls and 2 boys. And Chris came up to my place and we talked about all the things that had happened in his life and how he ended up in prison. It was generally about being absolutely outraged on the streets when he was living on the streets and the violence. And he was at that stage looking for his sisters who'd been removed. We eventually found his sister. She had moved down to a place called King's Cross. She got away from her place of placement after she'd been moved, and she ended up on the streets, working the streets in King's Cross as what you would call a prostitute or whatever. And she just recently passed away. She came up to my place one day. They had placed her in jail for a while because of what she was doing. And Chris was up there doing his work, and so I won't use her name. She's passed, but she came up to my place and she would sit up all night because her activities had always been on the streets at night. So I put her on a computer so she could just type out 2-fingered stories for herself, things she was remembering. And one night I came out and she was sitting there on the computer, and I sat beside her just to be there with her. And she said, read this, and I read this, and read that. And then I said to her, did you ever attempt to get away? She said, yes. They hung me on needles, and she lifted up her shirt to show the scars. So I guess what I'm talking about here, and I'm so essentially grateful for this book, and I have told lots of people about it and told them that they need to be reading your book, your truth telling, the things that are so important to our women here in Australia. That sometimes the stories that we hear we don't want to hear. They're too painful. And sometimes the stories aren't told because they're too shameful. But I'm yet to meet an Aboriginal woman in Australia who choose to walk this path. They were pushed into it. Things happened to them. And as they negotiated their way through all of that, they made sense of the only world that they knew, because they had been so pushed aside. And I'm talking now more particularly about removed women who were finding their way and never found their way home. And in particular, I'm giving honour and respect to Chris Edwards-Haynes' sister, who's just passed, and I'm actually really grateful that she's now passed and she doesn't have these memories. You said that fighting to end male violence against women in Canada becomes a discourse, but not just a discourse about male violence against Indigenous women in Canada, but I would like to suggest, as you do, that the violence that I'm seeing in Australia is that violence against Aboriginal women, Indigenous women in Australia as well. And I will tell you now that in Australia we're not there yet, you're ahead of us. When I first went to Canada to try to understand things that were happening in Australia, I realised then that you're ahead of us. Your thesis is courageous. I loved the humour in your thesis. I loved how you confronted me as a reader. I loved how you challenged the Indigenous feminisation of colonisation, a gender-based analysis that we haven't yet really looked at properly in Australia. You know, the prison hulls came here at 1788. You were way ahead of us in your colonisation. But what we don't talk about is this, that within a few months, the ravages of the diseases that the prison hulls brought with them in 1788 started to take effect to the people living around Sydney, what is now called Sydney Cove. And suddenly they found bodies, just bodies dying from measles, common cold, stuff like that, because it had never been part of this country. But I want to tell you about a place called Port Macquarie. I was doing a workshop down there recently. Now, you don't know Australian history, but then we had a governor called Governor Macquarie. So the town was named after him. And I was doing a workshop with all of the workers in that town. And at the end of it, I was frustrated because they were all being very polite, and there was non-Aboriginal workers and Aboriginal workers together. And they weren't really getting into the guts of what needed to be dealt with if they were going to deliver services to those people who critically needed them. And at the end of the workshop, because I was cranky, I said, who in this town knows the history of this town, Port Macquarie? And I said, well, at 1832, what was left of the original people from there, the traditional owners from there, was 28 men, 2 women, 2 boy children, and no girl children. So the women, the boy children, and the girl children were taken by the invading forces, the old lads, the people who wanted access to bodies for sexual purposes. And this, in fact, was there for a genocide. And in that room, with all of the experts in that room who were delivering services across that community at that time, nobody knew their history, the stories. I think from my experience that the discourse, these conversations we have to have, is without intentional action to reduce that violence. I've engaged at many levels with government, and there's a judgment on those people who are maybe living on the streets or trying to survive by selling their bodies. And often they're controlled by gangs. And I didn't actually see anything in your PhD about that, but I can tell you now that the women I've sat with were controlled by those people who controlled the whole sex industry in some places. So it was an industry. So I guess for me, and I kind of visited this a bit in Canada, but not to the extent that you have done. There doesn't seem to be an intentional response by government. It's easier to lave than prostitutes choosing to do, the women that I know, to do what they do without actually understand what's taken them on that path. And so sometimes they don't have choices. I wanted to refer to something that you named, the informal conversations with Indigenous women friends and allies have brought a light to a previously hidden connection that warrants further investigation. The connection between sex worker advocates and the ways in which discourses of Indigenous women's trauma and grief are used to highlight particular patriarchal agendas and silence others, as the feminists. What I wanted to say is that, and I just should say to you that in 2 days' time I'm 80 and I'm really tired of this fight. I started this fight in when I was about 45. It's both a fight that has to happen, it's an awareness that has to happen on the ground, and we have to talk to in the way that you've documented very clearly in your PhD. But I also believe that we need to be engaging with government, because there is a judgment that is not in any way able to understand why the women, and I will extend that to say that the girls are on the streets. Sometimes they don't have choices. So perhaps there's a conversation that we have to have across our countries. We're both colonised countries. I searched in depth when I was in Canada for any documentation like we have, that I have in Australia, where that young Aboriginal kids were abducted. When there was massacres in Australia, where I'm involved in looking at massacre sites and the outcome of massacre sites, I don't know a massacre site where there wasn't also sexual violence involved. And it's interesting to me that the academics that have got this big funding to research the massacre sites needed to be made aware of that massacre sites were not just the massacres of people, but there was the intentional sexual activity, intrusion, violence on the bodies of the young females that were the survivors of those massacres. Look, I'm going to stop talking. I'm just really, really frustrated that I couldn't get through. I wanted to tell you that it's a book that changed my life because it got me to think more deeply. I loved the book. I loved your humour. I loved your energy in it, but it also, and I'm using the word loved in another way now, I loved the truth telling. I love that you're challenging us, that you're calling us to account and telling us we can do better. I just want to kind of finish that by saying that what I'm talking about here is that in one of the places where I've been working, I had become aware of young girls as young as 10 getting on the trucks for sexual purposes so they could earn $20 so they'd have enough money to buy food to eat that week. Now, I know these young girls, and the response by government was to put lights over where the trucks used to pull in to pick up these girls. Nothing more. We're talking about 7 generations in that place from the massacres, where the girls are in families that are in crisis themselves, and their mothers are the products of that. So I'd like to suggest that we also need to have these conversations, this courage to speak, and also to provide safety for the victims of violence to speak and be heard, even if the system labels them as sex workers or whatever. They've all got stories. Quite often, as I found when I invited Chris's sister to come up and stay at my place, control of her body was horrendous. I had no idea that any human being, I thought that you had meat hooks in a meatworks, not for those you wanted to control. I just want to finish by saying I want to thank you for the book. I've recommended it to quite a few people already and said, let's get it. And Spinifex always goes out on a limb and does things that need to be done, publishes what needs to be published. I just want you to know that you point out that in looking at Indigenous feminist theory, they kind of miss the point in prostitution. I think they do. You're right, you had to take a few giant steps backwards and to reevaluate your work and your beliefs and what you thought you knew. I like that, what you thought you knew. I've had to question myself all the time in what I thought I knew too. I'm just going to be quiet now, and I'm just going to ask people to respond to me. I just want to finish by saying, look, I'm a grumpy old woman, and I just wish we could all get real and do the real important work that needs to be done. Yeah. Thank you.
Judy, Sherry clapped when you said I'm a grumpy old woman because you can't see her. So I'm just doing a quick translation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
An important book, this book.
It sure is.
Even in the work I'm doing now, people close me down if I want to talk about prostitution and child prostitution of Aboriginal women and kids. it's not just women who are making choices. It's and I'm talking about young girls in particular. They're being forced into stuff. Yeah. So, okay. I'm sorry. I cannot. For the life of me, I've been still trying while I'm talking to you. I am trying to get this computer to work, and it just won't here. I'm out at one of the hubs here doing a workshop. Listen, the only other thing I want to say, thank you for referring to Diane Bell and Nirapa Nelson. I went to town on that here and confronted some of the women who said that Diane had no right to speak about that. She and they both had a really good relationship, and it was such an important paper. So thank you for bringing that one up in your PhD too. Thank you. I'm quiet now.
Well, thank you, Judy. And I'm so sorry you weren't able to get on and for us to be able to see you. But what you've said is really heart-rending. And I actually would like to ask if any other people, if A, Sherry, if you want to respond, and B, if there are any other women particularly who have questions to ask of Sherry.
I just want to say thank you for reading, and I'm not sure if she can hear me.
Yep.
Yeah, I can. Keep talking.
To just thank you for your words and for the work that you do, and for sharing, what you see, like the reality, the material reality, the conditions that women and girls are living in, and the the horrible lack of choice where they make these choices in prostitution. And I just think what you said was so important, that other people are making choices too, and these grown-ass men are making choices to go out there and pay a girl or a woman to perform sex acts on him. And that's that's we should be talking about that choice equally, and judging that choice, because that's not okay. It's not okay to do that and to demand that of others. And I just want to say too that the pain that, and I empathize with the pain that I can hear as you're speaking. And I mean, it is it's ongoing, and that's the thing, right? Like, and we talk and we talk, and the governments talk and they say all the right things, but it just keeps getting worse. And I just do want to highlight that just this year so far in Canada, there has been a very high number of Indigenous women, young Indigenous women, whose bodies have been found in garbage dumps, in landfills. And I think that that's something that has happened all along, but there's been quite a few women just recently. And I think that sends, like, what other message, you know what I mean? Like that kind of sums up how people think about us, right? And our value. And so I do think that, and I'll just end by saying that I do think that I get a lot of pushback too, and hostility too, but my work is women, my passion is women, my heart is with women. And so that's where you have to pick a place to fight from, right? And you have to choose what fight is going to be your fight. And this is the fight that I've chosen. And sometimes there's a lot of backlash against that. You're seen as somebody who's betraying your nation, or somebody who's betraying, your.
I just had that just a minute ago here.
Mm-hmm. And it's hard, and it's it's why we need to stick together.
Like that, because my family's okay.
Mm-hmm.
From a senior Aboriginal woman, yeah. And I'm talking about the kids who are in crisis here in Alice Springs at the moment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. yeah, I think we've got much more work to do on this. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I shall have to go. I've got to get a plane tomorrow and go back home, but I shall be reading that book again, only because it's emphasised for me that those who could make changes are silenced. They're letting it happen. They're blaming, they're putting their finger out at the woman or the young child, the young girl, or the young boy sometimes too, by the way, who gets on the trucks at the moment. And the three fingers are pointing back at them, but they don't see that. One thing that we probably need to be also looking at is the power that Indigenous women's had in their societies, in their families. BC, before Cook, I call it. Aboriginal women had knowledge and authority. And in fact, and we don't talk about it in Australia, and it's something we should do, is women were the law keepers. They were the ones that called bad behaviour to account. And it was the men they would then tell to go and clean it up. They were the ones that if a young man was misbehaving, they were the ones that called it to account. Women were also the ones that gathered the bulk of the food, and there's a mistaken part of Australian consciousness that says it was the men that did all this with their spears. They got out and got, but it was the women, the gatherers, who brought the bulk of the food into the community, the families. Yeah, but as soon as colonisation came, women were made subordinate. And in Australian history, their children were taken.
Mm. There is actually a question here too from Anne, saying that she understands about the Six Nations cultures before colonisation, which is that violence against women was an absolute no-no. It was simply existentially impossible to conceive and not tolerated. She says, in other words, Sherry, have you also gotten a glimpse of a society without male violence?
Yes and no. Yes and no. So I think, and these are the stories that we hear. I think as Indigenous women, we hear these stories of what it was and what it used to be like, and stories of the old people, and so we have that. We have that advantage, I could say, where we can begin, and maybe we can't fully see it, but we have those little seeds, and we can begin to imagine that the world was a different place. And I think a lot of women who don't have they don't have their stories, right? And so they don't even have that little seed to grow, to think about what the world could be. And so I think so many women can't imagine even what the world could look like if it was different. And if we don't have that sight, we don't have that idea of the goal that we're working towards, it becomes nearly impossible to fight for it, right? We don't know what we're fighting for. And so I think having that image is so important. And on the other hand, from what I know, and I go into the book, that male violence against women wasn't widespread as it is today. It did happen. When it happened, it was punished very severely. But also that women had employed many strategies to attempt to prevent or to deal with male violence when it happened. So for example, in many Indigenous cultures, if a man and a woman were married, or in a union together, he would go to her community. So she would be there with all of her sisters and her mom and her relatives. So it would be much harder for him to commit acts of violence against her, because all of her family's there, everybody who cares about her is there, as just an example. But that at the same time, there were practices of sex-based discrimination that did happen. And so on one hand, So it wasn't a utopia. It wasn't like a wonderful, I mean, it wasn't this like utopia, but it was very different than it is today. And that kind of, the heart of the culture was relationship and connection, not entitlement and dominance. And so it was very different. How different, we don't know. And I, as I say in the book, I don't know how useful it is to go into that in particular, but to know that it was different, and that is so hopeful. I think that should give us all hope.
There is a question here about your title, and I'm thinking that maybe what you're saying now connects to the title. Can you just talk a bit about Not Sacred, Not Squaws, what that means?
Yes.
For an Australian?
I came up with the title, actually. It was it was a protest, some event. Anyways, I was thinking about what to put on my sign. So I was like, I'm gonna put Not Sacred, Not Squaws. And my friend was like, she's like, you can do that, but I'm not gonna stand beside you. I was like, okay, fine. So she's like, that's too out there. But the title, I think the Not Squaws part, I think we can all, should be fairly easy to get behind, and that Indigenous women are worth more than, we're not garbage, we're not garbage to be thrown away in a landfill, and we're not here to be being raped by truckers, we as women, as female human beings, we have inherent value. And we're incredible in all kinds of different ways. And that's I think that sometimes this idea of the sacred, or women as sacred, it can be the other side of that coin, where you're limited in what you can do, you're limited in what you can say. As oftentimes, I've had lots of many times people have told me, I'm disrespectful to the elders, I'm disrespectful to the families of the murdered and the missing, all kinds of things. And they'll say, because this ceremony is sacred, or this whatever is sacred. And so when women are presented as sacred, it really puts us into this box that limits us. And so women are limitless, and that's, and we should be treated as such. And so I think both of those they're kind of the opposite sides of the coin. And so for me, it's really it's not about Indigenous. So we think kind of Indigenous women. So we think of, we'll say a non-Indigenous woman here. So we'll think Indigenous women, are not so good. We're not, we're garbage, we're stupid, we're lazy, blah, blah, blah. And then sometimes it happens where it's like, oh no, like Indigenous women are so sacred, and you're so, it employs this very stereotypical notion where you're, it's all ceremonial, and you're all very, very traditional, and, the eagle feathers and the beads and all these kinds of things that white people have decided represent Indigenous culture. So, so you're there, and we can't disagree with you because, you're Indigenous. So that's not where we want to be either. We want to be here, right? Where we're seen as equals and treated in that way. And where we can disagree with you, and you can disagree with us, and we can have these kinds of conversations, and I mean amongst ourselves as women. So I'm just not even including in men in this conversation. That we need to be able to do that amongst each other. And again, the identity politics here in Canada, and I'm sure in Australia, have just really made that almost impossible.
It's Judy. As I was listening to you talk, I was thinking of the importance that we have to open spaces up where we can converse, think, discuss plan different ways of doing things, not expecting that change is going to happen overnight. And I just shared before how I got to be where I am here now in Alice Springs. I was, and I might have shared it with you because I'm a little bit confused now because I've been doing two things at once, but I was working in Cape York and a small child was raped and an elder asked for help and none of the services would back her. They just said that this was cultural. So that was in 1987. It changed my life. I can give you the time, 10 o'clock in the morning on the 18th September 1987. Mm-hmm. So it's like that we're locked into a system that denigrates us, pushes us aside, doesn't want to listen, even when we're talking about a small child. And I wanted to make a point here, and I put it in my notes to bring it out, that I think that I'm involved in developing different forms of education where we can talk about how we can address issues of violence and sexual violence. Batter Institute is in this town here, and I've got a unit in there that I'm putting together on how we respond to child harm. So the story of Renata was when she came down to see me from the psych unit, the unit that they lock people up in who are, when I was doing my PhD, and I was running workshop after workshop after workshop, letting people just bring out their stories, share their stories. Renata was a young woman who had a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. And I remember the first day she couldn't move. We were doing some psychodrama and she was there with her brother who brought her down. But that night she came to me with her hands on her head and she said, quick, we were role-playing families, in fact, at the time. And she came to me and said, quick, my head's going to burst. And I said, oh, do you want to talk to me? And she said, oh, no, if I talked about it, I'd go really mad. And so I grabbed a sheet of butcher's paper and I said, draw it for me. And she came back with a piece of butcher's paper with a hand clenching a heart in it. There was 23 words, and all of them were words like stab, punch, hate, except for one word, and that was a little tiny word I could hardly read called love. And I looked at her and said, is that what's inside you? And she said, yes. So the next day I went out and I bought art materials for her, heaps of canvas paints, everything, brushes, and I said, paint for me. So each time we were running a group, she'd come down with a new painting and she explored herself totally, completely. In fact, in one of the paintings, I remember she was exploring her sexual identity. She was wondering, what who she was as a sexual being. But they were beautiful paintings, and my process was to stand in front of the painting and say, oh, wow, this is tell me about it. And then she would talk. Now, the point I want to make is this went on for 3 years. So there was therapy happening for her. And then the university asked us to put a course together for the university. So she enrolled. Well, when she was in that course, she was outspoken. She was, by the way, living on the streets generally, and would just come to what we were doing for the weekend. She was just enrolled, doing all this talking back to other students, engaged, and she did all her assignments and she graduated at the end of the year. And she came to me after she graduated and she said, I want to do the course again. And I said, but you've done it. And she said, I want to do it again. I said, I don't think the university would allow you to enroll in this course again. It's called Indigenous Therapies, by the way, Indigenous Healing Practices. Anyway, I said, well, you write me a letter and I will take it to the authorities and you have to argue why you should repeat this course. And she wrote the letter and she said, 70% of the course I did was for me to learn about me. And I learned 30% of the material that was presented for it to be a course in this university. I want to come back and I want to learn the 70% that I could have learned from the material. And I want to learn a little bit more about me. So she was allowed to participate the second time and she graduated. Again, second time in the same course. And then she came to me and she said, can we go for a walk please? And I said, sure. Now, I'd known her by this time for nearly 6 years, right? And I said, sure, let's go for a walk. So we went for a walk down the beach, and we were walking, you know, just at the water's edge with our feet in the water. And then she said, and I was just listening, I didn't know what she wanted to talk to me about. And she said, I've stopped it. I said, what have you stopped? He's been arrested. He's been charged. Now, the point I'm making in this story is that then she told me that he was the man that come to live with her mother when she was a small child. She put a thing against the door so he couldn't get in, but he still would come in. The mother left this man, got away from him, but he still traced her, so she chose to become homeless, so he would never know where she was. Because she was acting out on the streets at times, they put her in a psych unit. Then she came down to where I was. So for 7 years, she then chose to act on her own behalf. She had collected all the evidence she needed to have him charged by the police, and he did go to jail for his sexual violence on her. Why have I told this story? Because what I have found that sometimes when we're working with people who have been truly distressed, that we have to hold space until they're ready to act on their own behalf. That I can't come in and decide I know what to do, but I can hold space for them to see what they need to do. And in this case, she demonstrated it beautifully. I still see her every so often, and she's a blossoming young middle-aged woman now. So I think it's a story that has taught me a lot about not being too impatient, but just being there and continuing to hold space for us to truth tell, to bring out the courage of women and the abuse of men. This man, by the way, was a white man, but that I don't think that matters about colour. I think it's more about their choosing of behaviour. Okay, I'll be quiet now. Thank you for listening.
Oh, that's quite a story, Judy. Really extraordinary. Thank you. Is there anybody else here who would like to ask a question or make a comment? You have to unmute yourself if you want to speak. No? Well, I think we've had an extraordinary event happen here today in spite of your difficulties getting online, Judy. How we managed. And maybe we can have a written version of what you said and put it up on our blog. That might be a way to do it. Okay. Renata?
Yes, well, it was really incredible, and thank you, Judy. Your voice is so clear, and what you're saying is so really insightful and very, very important. And I was just thinking, maybe Sherry, we have to bring you over to Australia, and you and Judy could go on a tour together and meet with all these incredible, interesting women. Who knows? We should really start working maybe towards that. That would be fantastic. So I just want to do a few thank yous. First of all, of course, I want to thank Sherry for putting all the work that you have first in the PhD and then into the book, because you did. We asked you for a lot of rewrites, and you very patiently did that. And I want to thank Pauline Hopkins, who is our wonderful editor, and without whom this book would not be as good as it is. Of course, I also wanted to thank Susan, who often doesn't get any thank yous because she's the boss girl and she tells us all what to do, and we all do it. And then, of course, we do. And then, of course, I want to thank Rachel, who is another boss girl who also that tells us what to do, and especially when it comes to IT, which we still are not terribly good about it. And then Caitlin Roper, who was here earlier and who does our wonderful social media. And I also want to thank Deb Snipson, who has done an exceptional cover with Jerry's artwork, which we unfortunately left off the cover, but it will be there when we reprint. It's Jerry's artwork, and then Deb has turned it into a great cover. And Helen Christie, who did really, really a beautiful interior, especially with the quotes from you, and those very irreverent subheadings, which we all laughed about. There's not a lot of things to laugh about this topic, but on the other hand, we all work on such distressing topics. And if there is not a sense of humor in what we do, we probably all would, you know, commit suicide, and that wouldn't really help anybody. So I thank Judy for all your works, years and years, decades and decades of hard work. Of course, your fabulous book, Trauma Trails, that is still one of our bestsellers, and we reprint it with pleasure. Waiting for the next one, I might say. And thank you, Sherry, again. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And this will go up on YouTube, and then more people can also listen to it. And meanwhile, nobody has any answers to how to stop men from violating women, whether they're indigenous or white man or brown man or yellow man. They just keep on doing it. And what the government is doing is totally inefficient, and because they don't actually have the guts to do something really, really groundbreaking and really go in at the beginning and not sort of at a level that suits them. Anyway, thank you to all, and have a good day, end of day, or good evening, if you're sharing. And then here is how to order the book. You can obviously order it from any bookshop. In fact, go in and tell them to order the book. But if you are in the UK or Canada or America, you can see where you can order them there. And then, of course, there's the Spinifex website. It's always there, and it gets out very quickly by Danielle Osborne, who I think I haven't mentioned before. She's our very new beautiful, wonderful office manager, stepping into the very big shoes of Marilyn to fill, but she has done that. So, all right, that's goodbye from me to everybody, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you. All the best. See ya. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for coming along. Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you.
That was great.